Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today is a book club episode, and we have Desmond Alexander on our show today to talk about his new book within the ESBT series, which is the Essential Studies in Biblical Theology series by IVP Academic. Phenomenal series. We've had other book club episodes with books from this series. This one is actually going to be called Face to Face with God, a Biblical Theology of Christ as Priest and Mediator by Desmond Alexander, once again. So if you go to our show notes, you can find a link to IVP. You can find this book as well as the whole ESBT series that we've talked about, and you can grab all of them. Why not? Just grab all of them. And there's some other books from IVP that we've done on the show as well that you might recognize. You're going to find some information about how to become a bridge builder. That is what we call our group of supporters that help us bridge the gap to keep going forward in our show and bringing you guys good content. You're going to find some information about how to find a local church near you. So you'll hit that link and type in your zip code. Generally speaking, you can find a Reformed church near you. If you can't find one very close near you, that you can talk to maybe reach out to us or talk to some other people, and maybe we could figure out a place that's in need of a Reformed church. You're also, speaking of that, you'll find out information about Peter's church plant and church plant efforts here in Orange County with Santa Ana Reformed. That church that he's going to be opening up, Lord willing, later this year. So you can find out information how to actually connect with him directly, ask questions when the Bible studies are, more about that church. And then there's some other information about Desmond Alexander. And if I haven't forgotten anything else, I guess we could jump into today's show and let Peter further introduce Dr. Alexander.
Yeah, we like you said, Dr. Desmond Alexander, who's the senior lecturer in biblical studies at Union Theological College. We are very excited to have him. He has a bunch of other articles and books that he's written. Some that people on this show who listen to this show may have heard before. One of them that I've read before, From Paradise to Promised Land, was really influential to me, reading it a couple years back. And we read it here at Westminster as well. But very excited to have you on, talk about this book, particularly Face to Face with God. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Alexander.
My pleasure to be with you. It's lovely to meet you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we were just talking before recording. How are things going for you in Ireland? How has life been these last couple of years for you?
Oh, it's been a challenge with COVID, and still continues to be the case. I think last week the news was telling us that possibly 1 person in 8 has COVID at the present time. So it's pretty rampant. A guy I was standing beside talking to yesterday in church messaged me this morning to say he had tested positive. So I'm hoping that I wasn't too close to him.
Yeah. Well, and you're going to totally make fun of me as an American saying this, but I don't know when this show is going to be published. Peter does the scheduling, but as we're recording, we're a few days away from St. Patrick's Day, and you're in Ireland. This was too perfect, but you're going to totally make fun of me for even bringing that up. But
that's true. Yeah.
Not at all. No.
I was going to point out, those who are watching on YouTube are going to notice this is the first time I've seen anybody with relatively the same setup as Nick, who's got his headset on and it sounds like a pilot. And so every once in a while I want Nick to start this off with like that American Airlines or that Southwest Airlines, like they joke around on their headset. They sound exactly like pilots. I don't know what I sound like, but this is the first time I've seen 2 people or 1 person copying Nick on his headset. So this will be fun.
Oh, Dr. Alexander sounds way better than me, because I've also been fighting I don't have COVID, but I've been fighting some sort of sick cold or something like that the last couple of weeks, and so I
From
sound
your son, though, right?
Yeah, extra nasally. Yeah, you know, I'm in that stage of adulthood or parenthood where my kid is new to daycare.
Yeah.
And so all these parents out
Which
there
is
are probably
rampant
not in
bacteria
there.
all the time.
Oh my goodness. I never thought I thought as an adult that I was over I never really got sick up until, you know, my kid getting in daycare. Now I catch everything
Yeah.
he gets. So.
Yeah. Well, cool. I mean, thanks for coming on, Dr. Alexander. If you can tell us kind of a little bit about yourself, your background, and some of your work in the Old Testament, how you got into the Old Testament work, what's been influential for you, and then some of the background for writing in Dr. Glad's ESBT series as well.
Okay, it is perhaps a long story, but so I won't go tell you everything. But I ended up doing a first degree at Queen's University in Belfast in Semitic studies. It wasn't my intention when I went to university, but God has a strange way of opening doors that you don't expect. And a consequence of that was that I ended up with two wonderful teachers, two evangelical scholars. One was Gordon Wenham, who has written a great deal on the Pentateuch.
Yeah,
and the other was
influential scholar. Yeah.
Yes. And the other was a man, David Gooding, who may not be so well known, but David Gooding was an expert on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And but he was also a very interesting Christian teacher. He was from a Brethren background, but had a wonderful way of expounding scripture and of exploring themes. And I think between the two of them, I imbibed a great deal that has been helpful to me over the years. I ended up having the opportunity to do a PhD under Gordon Wenham. Worked on the book of Genesis. And then again, by God's wonderful guidance and doors opening that I didn't expect to open, I taught in the university for 19 years in a secular setting, but I taught biblical studies and Hebrew, particularly the Old Testament. So my background was very much in Old Testament. That was I find myself in a strange situation. I'm teaching in a theological college, but I don't have a degree in theology, which must be rather strange for where things are. But with all of that, I also had a passion for understanding or wanting to understand how the Old Testament related to me as a Christian. And so over time, I got involved in a study group that was connected with Tyndale House in Cambridge. And out of that, I ended up being the editor for the New Dictionary of Biblical Theology, which Brian Rosner, who at that time was in Aberdeen, but it's now in Sydney, he was one of the co-editors, as was the consulting editors were Graham Goldsworthy and Don Carson. So that in a way, I suppose, got me into biblical theology. And I then had a career change for 10 years. I moved out of the academic setting to become director of Christian training with the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. And that gave me an opportunity to produce short 5-6 week courses for lay people. And that probably changed my direction in terms of academic study. I began to think more about how Scripture as a whole relates to Christians. Out of that came a book, From Eden to the New Jerusalem, which was picked up in the States by Kriegel. And they subtitled it differently to how it was subtitled in England, which caused a bit of I suppose anxiety for some people, because they would see this book that had part of the title was the same and then part of it was different.
Like, is this a different book or is this the same thing?
Exactly, yeah. And anyway, Kriegel put on it, they called it an introduction to biblical theology, which was not what I had set out to write.
Yeah.
But it seems to have gone down well
Huh.
in terms of having been picked up as an introduction to biblical
Yeah.
theology. So I'm not too troubled by that.
Yeah.
And that has kind of, I suppose, moved me more and more away, partly away from just working on the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So I've ended up doing a couple of other books on biblical theology. One entitled The City of God and the Goal of Creation.
Mm-hmm.
And then this most recent one, Face to Face with God, looking at Christ as high priest and mediator. Ben Glad approached me about 6 years ago,
Okay.
2016, to write something for the series. Initially, he asked me to do something on creation and new creation. And I was a bit reluctant to go in that particular direction, because I felt I'd already said what I wanted to say on that subject elsewhere, and was keen to do something different. And I was completing a pretty significant commentary, in terms at least of size, on Exodus. And in the process of doing that, I had spent a lot of time thinking about the tabernacle and the role of the high priest.
Yep.
And that's what drew me in that direction. So this book arose out of having to work on a commentary on Exodus in particular, and then an invitation to participate in the series. And in dialogue with Ben, we came up with this subject. So that's a little bit of the story.
Yeah, awesome. That's great.
Of just my story, and also of where the book has come from.
Yeah, perfect. I know people, those who hear these and maybe read you or read other authors, I think it's helpful for them to know a little bit about your background, so they can know this coming to the book. And okay, I see where he's coming from. I see some of his background, and this helps me read a little bit of his work. So that's really helpful.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, thank you. This series really aligns with our podcast well. That it's deep, great, rich theological content that goes through cover to cover of the Bible, but in a concise, easy to read way. So lay people can read it, digest it, learn from it.
Yeah, we love this series. It's been an incredibly popular series on our show already, and that we've seen on social media, and that we've seen from Dr. Glad. So it's an incredible resource for the church.
Yeah, and people that are in parts of leadership at church, seminary school and whatnot, they could definitely learn from these works as well. I mean, but I've yet to get even past the introduction of each one of these books in the series and not have it touch my heart like in a profound way. I'm like, and your book did that just the other night too. I was like, even just in their introduction, I'm like, oh my gosh, wow. Like some of this stuff is just explained so richly and beautiful. I love it. So talking a little bit about what this book talks about that a lot of Christians unfortunately know very little about would be maybe that starting off with the tabernacle. And we could go into that as like, what is this? What is its structure, the tabernacle, and why was it given to Israel?
Okay, thanks, Nick. Yeah, the structure is in some ways relatively straightforward. We're thinking about a tent with a courtyard that's created by a curtained fence that goes around it. It's meant to be a portable structure. The tent itself is divided into two compartments. So depending on which translation you read, it's the holy place and the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. The tent itself was designed with perhaps two main purposes in view. It's designed, first of all, to be a dwelling. So you end up, when you look at the Hebrew text of it, a word mishkan is used, which is often translated as tabernacle, but it's better translated just simply as a dwelling. God comes to dwell in this structure, in this tent. He takes up residence in the midst of the Israelite camp, and he's going to travel with them as they journey from Mount Sinai to the promised land. So the tent symbolizes God's presence among the people. He comes literally to dwell with them, and that is highly significant. That's going to have a major impact upon how the people live. It's going to affect their daily lives, having God's presence with them. That's in some ways the obvious thing that most people pick up on in terms of thinking about the tabernacle, the sense of God being present, living among the people. But as you also, as you look at the material about it, it's really interesting. When God gives instructions to Moses for the building of this particular structure, he begins talking about it as a dwelling place. And then halfway through his speech, he starts to talk about it as the tent of meeting. And he consistently then refers to it as the tent of meeting. And when he begins to do that, he then immediately introduces the high priest. He talks about the garments that the high priest is meant to wear and how he's to be clothed. And then he gives detailed instructions for the consecration of the high priest. So how he is to be sanctified, made holy, so that he can actually come inside the tent and be close to God. And then also, it seems almost out of place, but after you've had the instructions for the consecration of the high priest, you have instructions for the making of a golden incense altar. Interestingly, the other furnishings that were to be in the tent are a table and a lampstand and a chest, items that you might associate with dwelling, with it being a dwelling place. But the altar sits apart, and it's associated with this idea of the tent being the tent of meeting. It's where you encounter God, that draws attention, or at least these two functions of it being a dwelling place and then also a place where you meet with God. That draws attention to the importance of the high priest, and it struck me. And continues to strike me quite strongly that very often when people think about priesthood in the Old Testament, they think about priests in general. They tend not to focus in on the idea that there was simply one high priest who had a unique role to perform. So I've been working on a chapter for another book at the minute, and looking in particular at Leviticus chapter 9. And it's the chapter that comes immediately after the consecration of the high priest. And it focuses on what Aaron does in offering the initial sacrifices, setting up the sacrificial system. And the chapter is very much about his role as high priest. He stands apart. And so when we think about the tabernacle, we've not only got to think about it being a dwelling place, which is exceptionally important, but we've also got to see it as being the place where God meets with people. And that encounter centers very much on the high priest. The high priest is going to have a special role to play in that. And that's going to feed into the New Testament understanding of Jesus Christ as high priest.
Yeah, that's really helpful context. I think that helps us with our next question. And we hear this in Hebrews, and you interact in your book a lot with the book of Hebrews as it talks about the tabernacle, the priesthood. And so I think something that a lot of Christians may not think about, or just not really know what the relationship between this stuff is, and you talk about this a lot in your book, what is the relationship between the physical tabernacle on earth and this heavenly shadow that we're told about, or this earthly shadow of the heavenly reality that we're told about in Hebrews? How does the author of Hebrews kind of flesh this out, and how does this help us understand the physical tabernacle that we see, that we read about in the Old Testament as well?
Okay. God has essentially given us an earthly illustration of what something in heaven is like.
Mhm.
And it comes out in Exodus itself that Moses goes up the mountain and he has a vision of possibly the heavenly sanctuary and the heavenly tabernacle, and he then is able to replicate that on earth
Mhm.
with the earthly tabernacle. So there's a sense in which one illustrates the other, and we can see that connection.
Mhm.
And on the basis of that, the Old Testament material that has to do with what the high priest does at the tabernacle provides us with a way of understanding what Jesus Christ does when he ascends into the heavenly tabernacle. And so the author of Hebrews is going to talk about Jesus Christ and compare him to the earthly high priest. So there's a sense in which you can draw out parallels, but there are also some important contrasts. So for example, the author of Hebrews wants to make the point that the earthly high priest, because he's human and fallible, has to offer sacrifices to atone for his own shortcomings daily, whereas Christ does not need to do that. The earthly high priest goes in and out of the tabernacle every day, and he stands in God's presence. Whereas Christ actually goes into the heavenly tabernacle once and he remains there. He never leaves it. And he sits there. He doesn't stand in God's presence. He is seated as the high priest in the heavenly tabernacle. You also then begin to see that in the Old Testament setting, the high priest actually had the important role of presenting the offerings to God. So the animal, for example, for what we think of as the burnt offering, was brought and was laid on the bronze altar outside the tent. It was burnt there, and the Hebrew text uses a particular word for the burning. A word that basically means turn into smoke. And interestingly, the same Hebrew root
That's
provides
Qatar,
you hiktir, yes, Qatar,
yeah, hiktir,
yes. The same root provides you with the word for incense. So what's happening on the altar outside the tent is then replicated by the high priest inside the tent on what is in effect a model of the bronze altar. So the gold altar and the bronze altar resemble one another. And what the high priest does is he brings the offering into the sanctuary in order to present it to God. So even the Hebrew word that's used for offering conveys the sense of something that is brought near.
Yep. Korban.
Now, the most significant Old Testament offering is referred to in most translations as the burnt offering. The Hebrew word for it actually is a word olah, which means to go up.
Which isn't
ascend.
Hello in Spanish. It's it's to go up.
It's certainly not. But this olah is you could translate it as an ascension offering. And when you come through to the New Testament, then Christ ascends. The ascension becomes exceptionally important because he is going into the heavenly sanctuary to present the offering. In his case, the offering is actually the sacrifice that he has made, his sacrifice himself. He has offered himself on the cross. But the ascension is vital because that's the point at which he does what the high priest does. He presents the offering to the Father when he ascends into the heavenly sanctuary. So hopefully by seeing what's happening in the Old Testament sanctuary, we can begin to get an understanding of what's happening in the heavenly sanctuary. and that connection becomes really important. And I sadly for me, I felt that a lot of these ideas are missed by scholars looking at the biblical material. They don't quite connect the things together.
And a lot of Christians today have no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful too that our prayers are incense to God. When I first learned about that, that was just like so comforting and great to know. Connecting that language to what you're explaining and how we can play a part in it as well. And before I jump into one of my questions too, is would you say the tabernacle has a typological element to it?
There are lots of different things you can say about the tabernacle, and in terms of unpacking it. One of the things that struck me as being, I think, quite important is that the tabernacle is perceived as being a microcosm, a miniature of the world. So you get the sense of God coming to fill the model of the world. And that creates the expectation that in the future, God's presence will fill the earth. You find this, I think, then being fulfilled in the description that you have of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21:22, where it's described as being like a golden cube, which recalls the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament. In this sense, the tabernacle anticipates what's to come, this sense that God ultimately will not just be filling a small part of the earth with his presence, but the whole earth. I think this also explains why in the Old Testament you occasionally find the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, thinking about the earth as being like a tent. So they talk about the heavens being stretched out, or they talk about the earth having pillars, kind of pillars that would have supported the roof of the temple. They have no way of seeing the earth from beyond, and so they mistakenly, I think, in one way, they assume that if the tabernacle or the temple is a model of the earth, that's then the structure for the earth, and they draw that out in their comments that they make about the shape of the earth.
And you rightly spend so much time in Exodus and Leviticus and of course Hebrews. So how do these help us form our understanding of the priesthood and Jesus's ministry, even as our mediator?
Certain books of the Bible develop certain themes or ideas more fully than other books. So interestingly, you can read through the whole of Genesis, and if you based your understanding of God simply on the book of Genesis, you probably would not have much of a sense of God being holy. Holiness is hardly mentioned at all in Genesis. Yet when you come to the book of Exodus, you begin to encounter it. Moses at the burning bush, the ground is holy because of God's presence. The Mount Sinai is holy because God descends upon it. The tabernacle is holy because God comes to dwell within it. Leviticus has a great deal to say about the significance of holiness. And as I was sort of drawing attention to, when you look at then what's said about the tabernacle, what a quarter of Exodus is given over to describing
a lot of it,
the instructions for the building of it, and then the carrying out of those instructions. And
where most Christians reading stuff of Exodus goes to die is a really important portion of of Exodus.
It seems on the surface, it seems very dry and uninteresting. Actually, when you begin to get into it and understand what it's about and what it's communicating, it becomes much more interesting, and there's a lot more to it than meets the eye, and there are subtle things that you need to pick up on. So Exodus and Leviticus draw attention to the importance of the tabernacle this model of the heavenly sanctuary, to the high priest, to sacrifices, to holiness. Here are concepts that are especially developed in these books. And when you jump to the New Testament, Hebrews tends to be the book that especially picks up on the ascended Jesus. So the Gospels are going to focus on, you might say, Jesus' earthly ministry.
Yep.
But it's only when you get to the book of Hebrews that you find a writer concentrating on the concept of the ascended Jesus and the significance of that. And it seems to me that in some ways the author of Hebrews is looking to explain to his readers why it is that Jesus has ascended to heaven but not returned. He wants to make the point that Jesus is still fulfilling a vital ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. And the way to understand that is to see that it's a high priestly ministry. And how you learn about that is by going back to Exodus and Leviticus and seeing what the high priest does there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's incredibly helpful stuff. And you pull a lot of these pieces together and you describe them in further detail. And I think one of the things that struck me, and I'm assuming is going to struck a lot of the readers of this book as well, was one thing I never really thought about was actually the lack of connection between Jesus and the Levitical priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood, because he comes from the tribe of Judah, which is not one of these priestly lines. So can you describe, because I think that may throw some people off. It's like, well, I thought Christ is a priest, and like, how can he be a priest if he's not in these line of the priesthood? So can you describe what the Old Testament says about the priestly descents, the unique ministry of Jesus? And this might be a slightly convoluted question too. Born of Joseph from the tribe of Judah. So like, we know he's a priest, and he fulfills priestly duties, but he's not of a priestly line. So can you describe, like, how does this relationship work?
Okay, there are a number of things that are very closely connected here. When you go back to Exodus, you see that the creation of the priesthood that's associated with Moses' brother Aaron is actually tied into the making of the covenant at Mount Sinai. So when the Israelites come to Mount Sinai, God invites them to become his people. When they agree to that arrangement, he then gives instructions for the creation of this tent so that he can come and dwell among them. And for that, for God's presence to be with the people, there has to be a high priest in order to ensure that the sins of the people are atoned for, that the relationship can continue. That the sins of the people will not drive God away from their midst. So the Aaronic priesthood is established, and under the conditions, under the terms of the Sinai covenant, the position of high priest moves from one person to another. So it's going to pass from Aaron to one of his sons, and then it will pass on in there'll be a dynasty of priests, and particularly of high priests. So there's always going to be one person who will be high priest, and that person has been, in a sense, appointed by God. God has chosen the high priest and has put in place the legislation to do with the Aaronic priesthood. It's tied in with the tribe of Levi. So all priests are descendants of Levi, but not all. So all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. So the priestly family is just one family within the tribe of Levi. But we discover that the other Levites are then appointed by God to assist the priests. So we talk about priests and Levites as if they were in some ways two separate categories, but in actual fact, every priest is a Levite. But they have this strong temple connection. So much so that when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, the two guys who come down the road to encounter the man who's been attacked are actually a priest and then a Levite. People connect it with the temple, people who are meant to be, you might say, more spiritual than others. They're meant to know what serving God is about. And they get it wrong. So priests and Levites stand apart, and there is this sense in which there's a family connection. Christ, however, does not belong to the tribe of Levi. He belongs to the tribe of Judah, and that's very strongly emphasized in order to underline his messianic sort of credentials. He's got to be a descendant of David. And so you have this significant distinction when it comes to the New Testament, that Jesus cannot belong. He cannot actually serve in the earthly sanctuary, because that would be to break the rules. He's not a Levite. He's not a descendant of Aaron. And so the author of Hebrews then, in order to address this particular issue, brings together two different things. He talks about a new covenant. So there's going to be a new covenant replacing the old covenant. And with the new covenant, there's also then going to be a new priesthood. And so Jesus Christ gets brought in at this stage as belonging to a new priesthood, a priesthood that is compared to that of Melchizedek.
Yeah, let's talk more about Melchizedek, because there's a lot of listeners and a lot of church and Christians have questions about that, and it's in Genesis 14, Psalm 110, and Hebrews 7, talking about Melchizedek. So how does Christ's priesthood shape Melchizedek's, and how does Melchizedek point forward to Christ? Because we hear about him with the encounter with Abraham as early as that in the Bible.
Yeah, again, this is a really interesting sort of issue to pick up on. First of all, I think there's something of a misunderstanding as regards how Hebrews is read and how Melchizedek is understood. Melchizedek is presented in the Old Testament essentially as one of a kind. He appears from nowhere and then he disappears.
He's there for a couple of verses that we never hear from him again.
He's just mentioned in a few verses. He's actually interestingly contrasted with the king of Sodom. And Abraham basically says amen to what Melchizedek has to say. And he says no to what the king of Sodom has to say. So the king of Sodom was going to offer Abraham a lot of wealth. The booty that he had captured, essentially in a way saying, well, if you want to establish a kingdom, if you want to be the ruler of a nation, then take it by force. Whereas Melchizedek focuses on God. He's the one. He's the one who has protected and blessed Abraham. He's going to be the source of blessing for the future. So he appears as a priest king, a very kind of unusual combination in the Old Testament. He appears and then disappears, and he is essentially one of a kind. There is no order of Melchizedek. Now, this is where the English translations in Hebrews are perhaps unfortunate, because they often speak about Jesus belonging to the order of Melchizedek. But there isn't a priestly order as such. Essentially, what the author of Hebrews is saying is that he is a priest after the fashion of, or after the manner of Melchizedek. In other words, he doesn't belong to a priestly order. his father wasn't a priest, and he's not going to have a son who's a priest. That was the case with Melchizedek. There's no evidence that his father was a priest or that he set up a priestly order. So the author of Hebrews wants to make this point, that there's something unique about Jesus as a high priest. He doesn't belong to the Levitical order because he doesn't belong to the tribe of Levi. His priesthood is something different. And if you wanted an Old Testament parallel to it, then Melchizedek is kind of the obvious person to go to. That gets reinforced in two ways. First of all, it gets picked up in Psalm 110, where if David is the author of the psalm, and he talks about his Lord, referring, I think, to the Messiah. And he wants to make the point that when the Messiah ascends to the Father, he is not only going to be appointed or recognized as king, but he's also going to enjoy a high priestly status. So Psalm 110 becomes significant because that's the psalm that essentially appoints Jesus as high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. And the parallel or the comparison that's made is with Melchizedek. So a unique priest, a priest king. Jesus is a priest king, but in one sense they're similar, but they are not connected in any way as belonging to the same order. They're similar in terms of fashion or manner. People who have been appointed to a priestly, kingly position, but they don't belong to an order that's connected genealogically.
Yeah, that's helpful, because I think a lot of Christians, and I thought for a while, either not really thinking about it or just kind of assuming kind of the general opinion was Melchizedek was some sort of theophany, that he was some sort of pre-incarnate Christ who comes before Christ in the flesh. And so when you look at Melchizedek, we say, oh, that's Christ in, like before his flesh, versus where the preacher of the Hebrews is really at pains to show, no, he's like Christ to come, because it doesn't show his actual genealogy, even though we know he has a genealogy, but it's meant to show us that he doesn't come from a line, that Christ doesn't come from a line, which makes him like Melchizedek. Is that do I have that right?
Yep. And if I can just add another little point, the author of Hebrews wants to make the point that, in a sense, Melchizedek's priesthood was never passed on to anyone else.
Yeah.
So in a sense, he remains a priest forever. Whereas with the Levitical priesthood, the priesthood passed on to the next generation. So once you died, in a sense, you were no longer the high priest. Somebody else took on that role. The author of Hebrews wants to make the point that never happens with Jesus Christ, because he lives eternally. So once he is appointed as high priest, he remains high priest forever.
So he more fulfilled that role versus got passed down to him.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. I think a lot of people just don't know what to do with Melchizedek, because he shows up out of nowhere, then he leaves. We hear about him again in Psalm 110. We hear about him again in Hebrews 7. You're like, what is Melchizedek? What's he doing in terms of the story? But now, I mean, it's really helpful that he doesn't come from the priesthood line, and he doesn't extend it, because he is the priest. And so we see the fulfillment of this, and the one who doesn't extend the priesthood line, who says, no, I'm the fulfillment of the priesthood. I am the true priest who now presents you to the Father. That's incredibly helpful stuff.
So with all this said, how does this connect Jesus to being the mediator? How does this make it where Jesus can be our mediator?
Okay. Let me say two different things here. First of all, in Christian theology, and I think you see this if you go back to someone like Calvin, for example, the concept of mediator is sometimes used as a very broad umbrella term. to cover everything that Christ does. So you could think of Christ being a mediator, a bridge between human beings and God, in terms of him being the Messiah, in terms of him being a prophet, and also then in terms of him being a priest. That's one way in which the term gets used. I haven't gone in that particular direction, because when you actually look at the biblical term mediator, it comes up mainly in Hebrews, and there it's connected very precisely with the idea of Christ mediating a new covenant. It's in this role as covenant mediator that the concept of mediation is used. You get something a little bit similar in Paul, where he talks about Moses being the mediator of the law, which is essentially the Sinai covenant. So the mediator is someone who not only brings the two parties together, but also ensures that that relationship continues. It's created, it's stable, it remains. So the mediator isn't, sometimes we in everyday life today, when we talk about someone acting as a mediator, we simply think of them as a facilitator. They bring two groups of people together who maybe need to be reconciled, and they facilitate that process of reconciliation. Well, Christ does that, but more than that, he guarantees that there will be a healing of the relationship. And so the concept of mediator is very much tied in with the creation of the new covenant. And in effect, the author of Hebrews wants to make the point that the covenant made at Mount Sinai failed because of the failure, in effect, of the priesthood, the high priest. The Old Testament high priest wasn't sufficient to ensure that covenant relationship would continue. But Christ comes as a perfect high priest, and he can ensure that relationship, the new covenant, then exists. So he offers a better guarantee to those who are part of the new covenant that their relationship with God will continue. So if you've got a perfect high priest, then you have more assurance that the reconciliation will be in place. That we come into a relationship with God. If we sin, if we fail, we have that assurance that we have a great high priest who understands our weaknesses, who's been where we've been, but who can also then intercede on our behalf, and who has provided a perfect sacrifice in order to atone for our shortcomings. So understanding Christ as our great high priest, as our perfect high priest, as our mediator, offers wonderful assurance to us that our relationship with God is something that's based on a firm foundation.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is a great way as we land this plan, as we end this interview. So as we've talked about Christ's perfect mediatorship, the covenant being sure for us because we have a perfect mediator, a perfect priest in heaven for us. What do you have? And I'm sure there's a lot of things that you're hoping your readers come away. But after somebody's listened to this, they're like, I got to buy this book. I got to read this, learn more about the priesthood, learn more about the tabernacle, learn more about mediatorship in general. So what are you hoping your readers come away with after reading your book?
I suppose I hope that they will come away with a fuller understanding of who Jesus Christ is. We all grow up with a sense of Jesus Christ being prophet, priest, and king. I suspect that the middle statement, priest, is the one that's the least well known or understood or appreciated. And I probably didn't really appreciate fully the significance of Jesus as our high priest until I actually got into working on the tabernacle in Exodus and seeing the significance of the high priest there. And so a better understanding of the Old Testament material actually then sheds light on how Jesus is presented as the high priest and the significance of that and the importance of it. So it's given me certainly a very fresh, better understanding of this aspect of Christ's ministry, which is, I think, sadly neglected. So that's something really important. I suppose, I hope it also helps readers understand something of why this material is there in the Old Testament to do with the tabernacle, why so much in Leviticus, how is it relevant? Well, I think it sheds light on Christ and helps us in that way. So I suppose helping people to understand the Bible better, seeing how the Old Testament actually provides information, material that enables us to read the New Testament better. Just a better grasp of the Bible, essentially, and through that, a better understanding of Christ. That's what I hope in some way might come out of taking time to read the book.
I love it. I know I can speak for Nick as well, that this helped us better fill out understanding of what Christ has done, who Christ is, and what he's done for us. So my last question, as we end up most of our interviews, is where can people find you, find your work, and if they're like, oh, this is great, I want to read more of Dr. Alexander, what he's done, some of the stuff he's produced, and is there anything that you're working on that you've kind of also talked about some stuff that we can look forward to as well?
Well, I'm presently working on a book on the kingdom of God, which probably will be another couple of years maybe before it appears in print. All being well, in the next month or so, a fourth edition of my book From Paradise to the Promised Land is due out. So
Baker's doing that, right?
Baker books are doing that. So that's something fresh and new that is there. I suppose if somebody wants to get a sense of other books that I've written, maybe one of the easiest ways, not that I'm recommending that you go and buy them on Amazon, but if you go to Amazon and look up my author's page, you'll get a listing of other books. So that's probably the easiest way to actually get a sense of things that are there.
Great, well, I don't know if Nick, you've anything else, or Dr. Alexander, if there's anything else you want to point out before we end this out.
Maybe Peter, we could put that in the show notes, so list of his other works, to make it easier for people.
Author page up there too. They can go look at that stuff as well. And as usual too, and especially with the NSBT series, we have a special agreement with IVP where whenever we interview one of the authors for the NSBT series, we give away the entire series. So if you guys go to our Twitter, and we're also doing an Instagram, guiltgracepod, you guys will see all 6 volumes, including the new one with Dr. Alexander. So this will come out on a Thursday. So tomorrow on Friday, you guys will enter for your chance to win all 6 volumes, and you guys get to read them chronologically, whatever you guys want to do, learn more about Christ and his work. But we're very thankful for your work, Dr. Alexander, thankful for this book. It was a pleasure to read. I mean, I loved reading it. I think I read it in 3 days. It was really, really interesting. Really good. So thank you for your work.
Thank you for saying so.
ESBT series, by the way.
I don't know why I said NSBT series.
Well, isn't it a condensed kind of version?
That's true. Yeah, it's kind of like the NSBT. Yeah, if we were given that's 59 volumes in the NSBT versus the versus the ESBT series. Yeah, we're giving away the ESBT. Yeah, thank you, Nick. We're giving away the ESBT series, all 6 volumes, so including Face to Face with God. So yeah, thank you for this. It's been a pleasure having you on, and hopefully we can have you on again soon in the future.
Well, that would be my pleasure too. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.